Camelot Software are a company known for two things: occasionally decent Mario sports games and the Golden Sun series. Shining Force? What the fuck is that? It's like toothpaste or something? But little did you know, they were actually responsible for the first turn-based RPG on the PlayStation, and it would have been the first RPG in general if not for Kingsfield. This game was known by the generically redundant Beyond the Beyond. It should have just been called Beyond. Or The. And from the little I know about Golden Sun, it seems that plenty of the design and features were borrowed from this early PS1 enigma. That's why I've started the Golden Sun series with this game, as the heavy overlap in style and approach seems way too coincidental to be anything shy of a spiritual predecessor. Ideally, I'd like for this video to exist as a bit of historical context for the games that followed it, and also to highlight Sony's answer to the RPG drought, which took place during the formative years of the PS1. What little information I could find shows that Beyond sold well over 100,000 copies, which suggests that the drought was so bad people would buy whatever as long as it was an RPG. These are my kind of people. While Beyond does come bearing some neat concepts, it's still quite primitive in approach, in the sense that it apes Dragon Quest like a motherfucker, but hey, I like Dragon Quest. There are churches with priests in them for resurrection, curing ailments, and saving, and after you save, you'll be asked if you want to quit playing. Selecting targets in battle is done on a group basis rather than single enemies, and the amount of pot and wardrobe searching you do in this game is actually not that bad. Most of the terrain sifting is under beds and tables, which is a neat convention flip, but it's still a bit Dragon Questy. You can also make text boxes blue with a white font. I'm not saying it's not a coincidence, but I think it speaks for itself. Anyway, at the title screen, you're greeted by Tumblr, who gives you this gremlin-looking thing, then feeds you a couple generic JRPG lines and sends you on your way. This thing, or what the game refers to as a dragon, is the mouthpiece for the silent protagonist, and functions as a fairly non-intrusive way of delivering some light tutorial. He also teams up with the boy during combat as a visual indicator of a critical hit while remaining absent otherwise. I love unnecessary intricacies like this, and it shows that they were genuinely trying to make a standout product, just that they may have overlooked a few things. Another small addition which I'm quite keen on was how strong party members were balanced in the early game. A cheeky trope which occasionally appears in JRPGs is when you're given an immensely strong unit for story purposes and they're either killed off very quickly or they leave shortly after arrival. Beyond delivers two fake outs back to back. After saving a young prince from a cell, a witch curses the buff character, then his sprite's rotated 90 degrees for a little bit, which naturally causes you to think death is imminent. Then he just stands up and walks it off like a mad lad. Shortly after this, he splits from the main party, and you're thinking he's totally gonna die off screen, right? Like a cheeky Todd Howard atop a stage, you've been rused again. He just meets up with the party immediately after and joins until the end of the game.
Degenerates.
It's nothing revolutionary, but retroactively subverting expectations from the practically ancient year of 1996 impressed me far more than I thought possible. They also use it as a means to bridge narrative elements to the gameplay, so those pretentious fags who use words like ludonarrative dissonance can fuck right off. The buff character stays cursed for about half the game, and this impacts his performance in battle, which is not only a great way to balance him, but gives you a genuine motivation to see him cured. Nothing makes me care more than something which directly affects or hinders gameplay. You can throw all the AAA hand-holdy parent simulators you want at me, but I'll never have that same kind of motivation which accompanies a weakened buff dude in a JRPG. Maybe that's just me. While what I've just described sounds pretty great, it's not representative of the entire experience, unfortunately. When moving around, pressing the X button will bring up a Dragon Quest-esque menu, which functions fine in the Dragon Quest games where NPCs stop moving during said menu. However, in they continue moving while the menu is open. Given that you yourself can't reposition while in menu, this means that between you opening the fucker and selecting the talk option, the NPC is usually halfway across the map. Luckily, using triangle bypasses all this bullshit by acting as a standard interact button and immediately defaults to the most optimal selection depending on what you're interacting with. What I'm getting at is, why bother with the Dragon Quest menu when you've got so many buttons to work with? Or if you have to have it, why not bound to a secondary button? Triangle feels bad, and I get that you're proud of your NPC movement, but come on. That's a fucking minor gripe, whatever. Alright, back on track. The art style is pretty hit and miss, or I guess a mix of insultingly safe and exceptionally stand out. When characters speak, they've got a little face icon which blinks and flaps its gums. This is another one of those small, unnecessary elements which makes the game feel more robust, and like the team behind it wanted to put out some next level shit. This is also seen in the sprites as they're shrunk on alternating axes during speech, which naturally draws the eye and makes them feel more animated, which I guess they technically are. The maps themselves adhere closely to a JRPG stencil, and there's nothing particularly special about most towns, dungeons, and even the world map. There are, however, a select few set pieces which practically explode off the screen. Some from their artistic mastery, and others because they use bizarre visual effects you don't see too often. Toward the beginning of the game, there's a mandatory sliding puzzle which looks absolutely stunning. This type of puzzle's completely worthless in any gameplay sense, but it looks so good. Really putting that advanced PS1 hardware to use, making some cuties. In the later stages, there's some fantastic looking terrain, which does a great job of not only keeping your attention, but also sculpting a world that doesn't have much else going for it. And for an early PS1 game, the 3D effects are actually quite good. Certain dungeons contain this bizarre cylindrical scrolling effect, which is used a handful of times and never failed to impress me. The first instance appears in this incredibly tall tower, and is used as forced perspective to show how far up you've climbed. As an additional bonus, there's no random encounters during these sections, which is a blessing, and I'll explain why later. The effect is also used to emulate the inside of a cylindrical structure. It's an awesome way to spice up traversal, and a neat method of tweaking an existing effect to make it feel different. It's just a shame that stuff like this is so infrequent and takes a backseat to largely standardized visual design. The visuals in combat also fared quite well. As you'd imagine, battle takes place in a 3D environment, where the sprites are designed on an angle and locked to the camera. Now the camera's quite active, and this is a decent way of making the sprites feel like a part of the environs, but it goes a little overboard. Every time you even look at the confirm button, the camera spazzes the fuck out, and it can be incredibly disorienting. It also looks like shit. I'm sure the idea behind this odd choice was something to the effect of, we gotta keep the battles interesting for the spurgy kids with no attention spans, but the only way to successfully do that is by adding dating mechanics. This attitude's also seen in how combat plays out. While Beyond is a fairly standard turn-based affair, it features a system known as the active play system. Now this ain't some Legend of Dragoon shit, where well-timed hits deal more damage and net special Dragoon points. No sir, this is a mash the X button and you might do some extra damage. From what I can find on APS, it's all about mashing as hard as you can whenever anyone does anything in combat, and it slightly increases your chance for a critical, a follow-up attack, or to block an enemy attack. I have no way to verify this outside of some loose info I found in an FAQ, but I started using it about a third of the way through the game and did notice a higher trigger rate. Completely unscientific in approach, but I ain't no scientist. I do know a lot about triggering though. Combat in general is an absolute mess, but some interesting ideas lay amid the rubble. Health has two currencies. There's vitality points, which is just a less common synonym for HP, and a unique stat known as life points, which is some new shit I've never seen before. It's like a backup life counter, and it restores your vitality when it reaches 0. It's not a one-to-one conversion, however, as it seems life is worth anywhere from 2 to 5 vitality, and the value it restores is ostensibly random. Once life hits 0 and then vitality follows, the character finally dies. Losing your VP means you miss a turn, so you still want to keep that shit high, but there's a lot more chances to stuff up in combat, which is seen in the difficulty of random encounters. Regular enemies can push your shit in with ease, but because the LP system's so forgiving, it puts a larger focus on challenging you in standard encounters with very little trade-off. With that said, it often feels cheap, as though you're a victim to the enemy's speed stat, which can lock you into a constant state of no VP, which means no turns, which means death. This was only a problem in the late stages of the game, where 4 or more enemies rock up in any standard encounter, outspeed you, and brutally blast away with their strongest magics. I had a really tough time with this, specifically in the final dungeon, and I wasn't gaining stats fast enough from grinding. I did a bit of research to make sure I hadn't missed anything, and found that there's a weird optional item which permanently reduces all incoming magic damage by half. People seem to speculate that it's a bugged item, but without it I may not have beaten the final boss. With the item it was a complete joke, but before I picked it up I could barely last a couple rounds. It's definitely overpowered, but because it may not be intentional, I wouldn't feel right whinging about it. However, it does highlight some late game balancing issues. While we're kind of on the subject of bosses, let's talk about them, and how they're largely absent. My playthrough of Beyond clocked in at just above 40 hours, and in that time I fought roughly 10 bosses. Now that's not a lot of bosses, and what's weirder is that the first one didn't rock up until about 15 hours into the game. Initially, the lack of bosses is an interesting idea, as you get to the end of any given dungeon expecting a fight, and there's nothing waiting for you. It's a neat way to subvert expectations, and it means that I don't have to save resources on my trek through, so I can go all out against common foes. Even with that, I still think it's ultimately a poor design choice. Since common enemies are significantly weaker, it's tough to gauge if I'm appropriately leveled. This led to the first boss absolutely destroying me. There's also minimal opportunities to go all out against a foe, since there's very little which can take the full force of your party.
What am I fighting
It made me miss the concept of the boss fight, a staple which I usually take for granted and occasionally dread. Bosses in JRPGs act as a clear indicator of a difficulty curve. They're essential to not only challenge the player, but also as a progress check of sorts. You need to be able to make it through a dungeon, and then with what little energy and resources remain, take down a foe larger than you've ever fought before. If it doesn't gradually ramp up to fighting God in a space-time vortex, is it even a JRPG? I think Beyond has enough going for it that sticking closer to the mold would have worked to its benefit, but it's still interesting to see what a JRPG without bosses would look like. Not pretty. When the big boys do confirm their existence, they're just standard boss fights for the most part. I'd say the coolest thing about them is that they're susceptible to status ailments, and since they're largely magic based, a cheeky silence spell can render them complete pushovers. So far this video has been fairly positive, or at least optimistic towards some interesting design, but overall Beyond the Beyond is a fairly mediocre and forgettable experience. There's a lot of backtracking, and this is partly due to the vague nature of dialogue, but primarily to the lack of a solid quick travel method. About halfway through the game, every playable character is given an item which permanently takes up a single slot in their limited inventory and enables them to warp to one another. When you unlock excess party members, you send them to a town you've previously visited and they wait for you there. This is a great opportunity to give characters backstory, or for interesting events to take place depending on who they are and where you send them, but to use it solely as a warp function just adds unnecessary steps. The quick travel process is as follows. Warp to place I don't want to go, talk to my benched party member, tell them I want to add them to my party, cancel out of the party screen, select the place I actually want to warp to, send them there, and then use the warping item to get to my original destination. In and of itself, it's not too tedious, but since there's so much backtracking, you use it often, and it gets old very quickly. It's a genuine shame that they didn't use this mechanic to build the world a bit more. Like, sending the pirate character to a town with a bar should give you unique optional scenes where he gets into a fight and meets up with an old friend, or some gay shit, I don't fucking know. And speaking of gay shit, this is the part of the video where I bitch about random encounters. Look, I'm the one guy on Earth who actually likes random encounters, but if you're gonna have a large focus on puzzles with physical elements to them, you really gotta dial that shit back for those sections. Plenty of other JRPGs do this and it shits me to no end. Generally, the puzzles are pushing blocks or pressing switches or something, so it's not too bad when you litter them with constant interruptions. Where Beyond fucks this up is that certain puzzles actually require a little bit of thought or pre-planning, which is fantastic, but the encounter rate within these sections is insanely high. It creates a direct disincentive to explore and plan your shit out before attempting anything because of how bogged down traversal gets in these interruptions. As I said, I have nothing against random encounters, but during puzzle sections the frequency needs to be at least reduced, if not completely disabled. They kinda toy with this idea during one section where blue heads with glowing eyes follow you, and while they're locked firmly in your rectum, random encounters don't trigger at all. It would have been nice if this was more widespread and applied to areas that actually needed it, but the game was made in 1996, so that ship sailed. The last few dungeons are awful for this. No, fuck that, they're awful in general. The final dungeon isn't so bad, but it does force you to run it twice. Granted, there's a decent gimmick which kinda justifies it, but it's still blatant padding. And I can forgive that if not for the dungeon which directly precedes it. It's some of the worst shit I've ever seen in a video game, and I've played Undertale. So this dungeon has about 5 floors, and each is filled with invisible pitfalls that send you back to the previous floor. The lower level has a pattern on the ground indicating where the hazards are on the floor above, but with the way the maps are, it's extremely hard to line up. This is another idea that could have been rad if it was executed well, but the state it's in, coupled with the incessant random encounters, it may very well be the worst dungeon I've ever seen in a JRPG ever. It took me forever to memorize 3 of the floors, and I just used a walkthrough for whatever was left. I generally don't use walkthroughs because I think it colours the experience, but I mean, my experience wasn't getting any worse or any better from that point, so it's a non-issue. Just before we end, I'd like to shout out the second worst dungeon, which is heavily puzzle-based and, while a great concept, requires you to go through it with just one party member. To make matters worse, the enemies aren't any easier to compensate for the lack of party. They're the same enemy types you fought in the previous dungeon. It's brutally difficult. Fuck this game. So that's Beyond the Beyond, a game which sold well for the time but is rarely discussed nowadays, and probably for good reason. It's a shame too, because it had so many neat ideas, it just failed to deliver on most of them, and what little is there is stumbled over in an awkward fashion. It seems like one of those growing pain games, utilising the new and powerful Sony PlayStation to add a lot of bells and whistles where a wind turbine would have been more beneficial. Sure, you'll hear a chime every so often, but that's a brief respite from the fact that the wind continues to blow past you when you fail to utilize it in any meaningful capacity. This doesn't mean you can't take those bells and whistles and strap them to something with a bit more to it. Time is the greatest healer, and this might just be true of video games as well as genocide. Hopefully Golden Sun is the wind turbine I've conceptualized with this shitty metaphor. So join me next time as I cover it and hopefully enjoy it. I hope to see you there. Thanks for watching.